He stopped her without cause, accused her of lying, but when he tried to assert control, he learned the hard way. She wasn't someone to be underestimated. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Baton Rouge, Louisiana, stretching shadows across cracked sidewalks. Lieutenant Imani Harper strode through the streets with quiet authority, the kind forged through years of discipline, of knowing exactly who she was. Her sharp brown eyes scanned the neighborhood, familiar yet distant, like an old photograph left untouched for too long. 7 years had passed since she was last here, since she enlisted, since she laid her mother to rest. Yet so little had changed. The same corner store still advertised 2-for-1 sodas, the same barbershop sign, faded but standing, the same basketball court where kids played like the game was life itself. Laughter, distant voices, the scent of fried catfish from Miss Laverne's restaurant. They wrapped around her, stirring memories she hadn't touched in years. She adjusted the duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Nothing about her screamed military, just a fitted t-shirt, cargo pants, worn sneakers. But even in civilian clothes, she carried herself differently. Shoulders squared, chin level, steps calculated. It wasn't something she could turn off. Her father used to call it a warrior's posture. She smiled faintly at the thought. He would have been proud if he were still here. As she passed a group of teenagers outside a corner store, one of them, maybe 16, glanced up, did a double take, and nodded. "You military?" he asked. Imani paused, locking eyes with him. "Something like that." The boy grinned. "Figured. My cousin's in the army, walks like you." Before she could respond, one of his friends called him inside. Just like that, he was gone. She exhaled slowly. Moments like these reminded her why she fought, why she endured. She had spent years in places most only saw in war documentaries. Kandahar, Fallujah, Mogadishu. She had led teams through the dead of night, through chaos and enemy fire, through sandstorms that devoured sound and light. And now, here she was, back home, walking streets that felt both hers and not. Her 20s were spent in war zones, her 30s unraveling what war had done to her. Now, at 40, she wasn't sure what home even meant anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted. A patrol car crept beside her, its slow, deliberate crawl unnatural in a neighborhood where cops usually sped past without a second glance. She kept walking, pretending not to notice. But she knew the drill. The window rolled down. A gravelly voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, miss?" She stopped, turned slightly, and saw him, Officer Derek Simmons, white, mid-40s, crew cut, thick arms, and a smirk that suggested he enjoyed this far too much. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but she could feel them raking over her, assessing, as if she didn't belong. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" he asked. Imani held his gaze, unreadable. She had dealt with men like him before, men who mistook a confident black woman for a threat, shifting her duffel bag strap, she said evenly. "Just walking. Where to?" She arched a brow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk down my own street." Simmons's smirk faltered, just slightly. "We've had some break-ins around here." "Gotta make sure everything's in order," he said. Imani met his gaze, steady and unshaken. "You see me breaking into something?" Silence. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned against the open window, exhaling sharply. "Just doing my job," Imani breathed through her nose, resisting the urge to shake her head. "Well, I'm just walking." She could feel the moment shift. Simmons wasn't here for conversation. He wanted control, and something about her, her presence, her refusal to shrink, wasn't sitting right with him. 2 choices, engage or walk away. Before she could decide, Simmons put the car in park. "Hold on a second, let's see some ID." Imani didn't move. Years of training kicked in. Assess the threat, the exits, the surroundings. This wasn't just about a badge. This was about a man testing his limits. And she already knew one thing. This wasn't over. The street felt still. Only the hum of distant traffic and murmurs from a nearby store filled the air. But none of that mattered. The tension between Imani and Officer Derek Simmons was thick, hanging in the space between them like a storm waiting to break. "ID," Simmons repeated, his patience thinning. Imani's eyes flickered to his hands. His right thumb rested near the latch of his holster. A silent message, a warning. She felt eyes on her now, pedestrians slowing their steps, watching, waiting, keeping her movements measured. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her military ID, held it up, didn't hand it over. Simmons squinted at it, then back at her. "Military, huh?" His tone was unreadable, but she knew his type. Men who looked at her uniform and saw an exception, not enough, never enough. "Where exactly do you serve?" "I don't answer unnecessary questions," she said, voice even. Simmons exhaled through his nose, lips pressing together. "That's so." Before she could react, he snatched the ID from her fingers, turning it over, studying it. A smirk crept onto his face. "Navy SEALs?" He dragged out the words like they were a joke. "That's cute." Heat flickered through Imani's chest. Not anger, annoyance, a familiar feeling in rooms filled with men who assumed she didn't belong. "Return it," she said, tone firm, controlled. Simmons tilted his head, studying her, like he was deciding whether she was worth the trouble. "You know," he mused, "I've been on the force 20 years, seen all kinds of people come through this neighborhood." A pause. "Never met a woman Navy SEAL before." His smirk deepened. "You sure this isn't fake?" The insult was so blatant, so absurd, Imani almost laughed. "You can run it through your system," she said flatly. "You'll find out soon enough." But that wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a reaction. He flipped the card again, lips curling. "You expect me to believe you've been out there fighting for this country? Please." A shift, small but noticeable. The people watching. Their curiosity was turning into something else. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. A young woman stood on the sidewalk, phone in hand, recording. She wasn't hiding it. She wanted Simmons to see, because that was the thing about power. Power shifted depending on the audience, Simmons noticed. His shoulders squared, stance tightening. "You got a problem?" he asked the woman. She didn't answer, just kept recording. Imani, still perfectly still, smirked. Just slightly. Now, Simmons was the one under a microscope. His jaw clenched as his gaze flicked back to her. "I don't appreciate people trying to make a show out of me doing my job." "Then stop putting on a show," Imani said. Something dark flashed across his expression. He stepped closer, just an inch. But it was intentional, a challenge. Imani didn't budge. "I don't know who you think you are," Simmons said, voice low, "but out here I make the calls." Her smile was faint, just enough to let him know he was making a mistake. "You sure about that?" Simmons' grip tightened on her ID. Then, right on cue, he did exactly what she expected. He reached for her wrist. Bad idea. The second his fingers brushed her skin, Imani moved. Fast, precise, calculated. Her arm shifted, just enough to break his grip before it even fully formed. Not aggressively, not in a way that could be mistaken for an attack, just enough to show control. Simmons' eyes flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected that. The crowd had grown. The woman with the phone stepped forward. A man across the street folded his arms, shaking his head. A couple by a food truck had stopped eating entirely. All eyes were on them now. Imani exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Years of training had drilled restraint into her bones. Discipline first. always." "That's assault," Simmons snapped. His voice carried too much confidence, like the words alone held power. Imani barely blinked. "No, it's called avoiding unnecessary contact." His expression darkened. "You think this is a joke?" She tilted her head slightly. "Do I look like I'm laughing?" Frustration flickered across his face. Simmons had expected submission, cooperation at the very least. Instead, he was met with resistance. Wrapped in calm, unshakable composure. He didn't like it. His hand moved toward his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup." "For what?" Imani cut in smoothly, Simmons's mouth pressed into a thin line. "For an uncooperative suspect." A scoff from the crowd. Someone muttered, "This is some bull." Before catching themselves, the woman with the phone spoke up. "Uncooperative? You're the only one getting loud." Simmons' ears burned red, but he didn't turn toward her. He was too locked in now, too deep in his own pride. Imani could see it. She'd been in enough tense situations to recognize a man at his breaking point. Simmons wasn't going to back down. Not now, not with so many eyes on him. Imani had to choose her next words carefully. "Officer Simmons," she said, tone measured. "You're making a mistake." His nostrils flared. "No, you made the mistake when you decided you could walk away from me." He stepped closer. One step too many. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Imani inhaled slowly, steadying herself. The energy shifted. The moment was spiraling. She knew where this was headed. Simmons wanted to make an example out of her. He wanted her in cuffs, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she hadn't obeyed him the way he expected. That she could not allow. The crowd felt it too. A murmur rolled through them. Phones lifted higher. The air thickened with unspoken tension. Imani's pulse steadied, instincts sharpened. She had 3 choices. Let him cuff her, give in, allow herself to be treated like a criminal in front of the entire neighborhood. Not an option. Run, force a chase. Even worse, stop this before it escalated into something neither of them could come back from. She chose the third. "Simmons," she said, voice calm but firm, "if you put those cuffs on me, you're going to regret it." His smirk returned, but this time it was forced. That a threat? Imani's eyes didn't waver. "No, it's a fact." But Simmons had already made up his mind. His hand dropped to his belt, and that was the last mistake he made that day, the moment his fingers reached for the cuffs. Imani moved, fast, smooth, intentional. Before his hands could even brush the metal, she pivoted, a simple shift of her stance, a calculated redirection. 1 step forward, 1 step to the side. Nothing more. But it was enough. Simmons' balance wavered, his eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. As he realized he wasn't in control anymore, Imani didn't attack. She didn't need to. She simply removed herself from his grasp. So seamlessly, so precisely, that Simmons looked ridiculous to the crowd. To the crowd, it must have looked like he was fumbling, stumbling over his own feet. And that was worse than any punch. The gasps from the bystanders confirmed it. "Damn, she slipped right out of that," someone muttered. The young woman with the phone zoomed in, her expression unreadable. Simmons' face flushed crimson, his breath quickened. His chest rose and fell like he'd just been insulted in the worst way imaginable. And Imani? She stood completely still, hands relaxed, unbothered. "Officer Simmons," she said, slowly, carefully, "you're losing control of the situation." His jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. She had humiliated him, without even touching him, and he couldn't let that stand. "Turn around! Hands behind your back!" His voice was sharp now, clipped with pure frustration. Imani exhaled through her nose. "For what?" she asked, her tone steady. "Resisting arrest?" A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. "Arrest for what?" A man near the corner store called out, We all saw that. She didn't touch you, man. Simmons ignored them, his fingers flexed, itching for something to grab onto. Imani had seen this before. A man backed into a corner, desperate to regain power. She gave him one last chance. You don't want to do this, she said evenly. Think carefully. Simmons' breathing grew heavier. His pride was screaming at him, demanding he take control, prove his authority, put her in her place. So he made his choice. He lunged. Bad move. Imani's body reacted before her mind even had to. Her foot shifted. Her hands moved. She caught his wrist mid-air, twisted it, not hard, just enough to redirect his momentum, and suddenly, Simmons was the one off balance. In less than a second, she had him turned. His own arm bent just enough to make movement impossible. She hadn't hurt him, hadn't even applied full force. But to the onlookers, the recording cameras, and most importantly, to Simmons himself, he had just been flipped like a rookie. And that was worse than anything else. A man in uniform, outmatched, in broad daylight, in front of an entire crowd, by a woman he thought he could intimidate. Silence. Simmons' breath came hard and uneven, his body stiff with shock. Imani held him there for just a second longer, long enough for him to understand. Then she let go. Simmons stumbled forward before catching himself. His arms flailed, just for a second, just long enough for every phone camera to capture it. And then the crowd erupted. Oh! No way! She just flipped his... The woman recording shook her head, grinning. Nah, I got every second of that. Simmons' hands curled into fists. His entire body radiated pure humiliation. Imani remained completely calm. Are we done? She asked, her voice steady. Simmons didn't answer, couldn't answer. Then a new voice cut through the air. What the hell is going on here? A second patrol car had just pulled up. Sergeant William Burke, older, more experienced. And from the way his sharp blue eyes flicked between them, he already knew something had gone very wrong. Burke stepped out of his patrol car with calculated authority. His gaze shifted between Simmons, face red, hands clenched, breathing heavy, and Imani, standing calm and unshaken in the middle of the street. But it wasn't just them anymore. The entire block was watching. Phones were up. Conversations had stopped. People weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. Burke exhaled sharply. He already knew what happened. Still, he turned to Simmons first. Officer Simmons, explain. Simmons' jaw worked, but no words came immediately. He was too deep in his own humiliation, too rattled by the fact that he had just been flipped in broad daylight. Imani could see the battle happening inside his head. He wanted to lie, twist the story in his favor, make himself the victim. But then Burke's gaze swept over the cameras, the murmuring crowd, and the unmistakable stain of public embarrassment already spreading. Simmons knew there was no way out of this. She resisted, he said finally, his voice low, strained. Wouldn't comply, got aggressive. A scoff came from the young woman still filming. That's a lie, and we all saw it. Burke didn't acknowledge her, but Imani caught the tightness in his expression. He wasn't buying it either. He turned to Imani. Is that what happened? She didn't rush her answer. Didn't need to. He stopped me for no reason. Asked for my ID, I gave it to him. A pause. Just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. Then he accused me of lying about who I am. Another pause. When I refused to let him put cuffs on me for nothing, he reached for me. I stopped him. Burke exhaled slowly. Assessing. Calculating. He knew the optics of this. A white cop, a black woman, a crowd watching with phones up, a power struggle that had gone way too far. Then, his eyes landed on the ID, still clutched in Simmons' hand, and in that instant, Burke's expression shifted. Recognition, then realization, then regret. Lieutenant Harper, Simmons' entire body went still. The moment her rank left Burke's mouth, it was over. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Simmons' face paled. His posture stiffened. Imani didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just waited. Burke's voice was quieter now, but sharper. "You're a Navy SEAL?" "Yes, sir." Silence. Burke's gaze flicked back to Simmons. "You knew that?" Simmons's fingers twitched around the ID. Burke didn't wait for an excuse. He turned to the crowd. "Anyone have footage of this interaction?" At least 10 hands shot up. The young woman with the phone smirked. "I got everything." Simmons's breath hitched. He knew what was coming. Burke's voice was low. Even. "Officer Simmons, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Gasps, whispers, a low ripple of disbelief. Simmons' face contorted, his hands balled into fists. "You can't be serious." "I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse." Burke's tone had finality to it. A warning. Simmons' nostrils flared, his entire body trembled with rage, but he had nothing left. Imani held his gaze one last time. No words, just understanding. She had won, and he knew it. Burke turned to Imani, his posture shifting slightly. Not defensive, not aggressive, respectful. "Lieutenant Harper, do you wish to press charges?" The air stilled. Simmons froze, his breath shallow. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Imani let the question settle, let the weight of it hang over Simmons. Like a final judgment, the weight of the moment hung in the air. Then, Imani exhaled. "No." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Simmons stared at her. Stunned. Burke studied her for a long moment. "You sure?" Imani nodded. "I didn't come home looking for a fight. I just wanted to walk in my own neighborhood." The words hit hard. Burke sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Understood." "What happens to him now?" she asked. Burke didn't sugarcoat it. "Internal review, likely suspension, maybe worse." Simmons looked sick. Imani didn't react. It wasn't her concern anymore. She turned to leave. But then, Simmons did something no one expected. He spoke. "Why?" His voice was quiet, stiff. "Why not press charges?" Imani stopped, turned back just enough to meet his eyes. Her answer was simple. "Because I already taught you the lesson you needed to learn." And with that, she walked away. Imani moved down the sidewalk, shoulders squared, steps steady. She didn't need to turn around to know every eye in the crowd followed her. Somewhere behind her, Simmons still stood, his entire career crumbling around him. Then, a voice from the crowd cut through the silence. "That's what happens when you mess with the wrong one." A few quiet chuckles, some murmurs. The tension began to lift, shifting into something else, a moment people wouldn't forget. Burke didn't move for a few seconds. His eyes locked on Simmons. "Go home, Officer Simmons." Simmons didn't argue. He just turned, stiff, robotic, and made his way back to his squad car, hands tight by his sides. The cameras followed him. His humiliation was now public record. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, Burke exhaled. Then he turned to the crowd. "Show's over, folks." Some people left, but others lingered, still murmuring. The young woman with the phone gave Burke a hard stare before lowering her camera. "He'll be back on duty in a few weeks, won't he?" Her voice was unimpressed. Burke didn't answer. He knew better than to make promises. "Just send the footage in," he said before heading back to his car. Imani kept walking. But she wasn't aimless. She wasn't the type to get rattled. Not anymore. Years of training, deployments, and high-pressure missions had built something inside her that couldn't be easily shaken. But that didn't mean she was numb. As she passed a storefront, she caught her reflection in the glass. Same stance, same confidence. but something deep in her chest still burned. It wasn't anger, it was frustration. Not just at Simmons, not just at this one encounter, but at the fact that it never really ended. She had faced worse than him overseas. But there was something about having to fight the same battles at home that left a weight in her stomach. Her father's voice rang in her ears. Pick your fights, win the ones that matter. She had won this one. But how many more would there be? She kept walking, pushing the thought aside, inside the police station. The fallout had already begun. Burke sat at his desk, the weight of the situation sinking in. The footage had already been submitted. The precinct would have no choice but to review it. And Simmons? He was done. Maybe not officially, maybe not immediately, but his reputation wouldn't recover. His authority had been publicly shattered, and that was something no badge could fix. Burke sighed, rubbing his temples. He had known Simmons had a problem, had ignored the signs, but now it was on record, and the city was watching, back at her father's house. Imani sat on the back steps, the worn wooden planks creaking slightly beneath her. The air was warm, thick with the scent of cut grass and the distant sizzle of something frying in a neighbor's kitchen. She let her shoulders relax for the first time all day. She was home. But what did that even mean anymore? Her hands rested on her knees, fingers absently tracing the seams of her cargo pants. She'd spent years fighting battles overseas, defending a country that still couldn't always see her for what she was. And today had been a reminder of that. The screen door behind her creaked open. You always sit like that when you're thinking. She didn't have to turn to know the voice. Uncle Ray. He stepped onto the porch, lowering himself onto the steps beside her. Broad shoulders, gray at his temples. A man who had seen his own share of fights, just not the kind with bullets. He set a bottle of iced tea beside her, then popped his own open with a quiet hiss. For a moment, they just sat there. Then Ray exhaled through his nose. So, you made the news, Imani huffed, a small, dry chuckle. Wasn't planning on it, Ray shook his head. Never are, but trouble finds us anyway. She picked up the bottle, rolling the condensation between her fingers. Wasn't trouble. Ray side-eyed her. Wasn't peace either. She didn't answer right away. Because he wasn't wrong. Imani had been trained to engage enemies, to neutralize threats, to walk into danger and come out the other side. But what about battles like today? The ones that weren't fought with fists or weapons, but with perception, power, and prejudice. She tilted the bottle back, letting the cold tea wash away the dryness in her throat. Ray watched her for a beat. Then he leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. You handled yourself well, girl. She nodded slowly. Did what I had to. Ray gave a small chuckle. Just like your father. That made her smile. Her father had always taught her that strength wasn't just about fighting. It was about knowing when not to. Ray's voice was quieter now, thoughtful. Simmons will feel this for a long time. Ray's tone was thoughtful, but more than that. A lot of people saw what happened today, and they'll remember it. Imani turned the bottle in her hands, the condensation slick against her fingertips. Does it ever change anything? She asked. Or do we just keep fighting the same fight over and over? Ray sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. You're asking the wrong question. She glanced at him. He tapped his bottle against his knee, considering his words. The question isn't whether it changes everything. It's whether it changes something. Imani let that sink in. Because he was right. She hadn't walked away from today changing the world. But maybe she'd changed something. Maybe some kid in that crowd saw what happened and realized he didn't have to shrink when authority got in his face. Maybe some other officer saw it and thought twice about pulling the same stunt. Maybe even Simmons. Though she doubted it, it would take a long, hard look at himself. And that was enough. For now, Ray nudged her with his elbow. So what now? Imani exhaled, setting her bottle down. I keep walking. His grin was small but full of pride. That's my girl, because sometimes the real fight isn't about winning or losing, it's about standing your ground. Even when the world tells you to step aside, it's about showing up, speaking up, and refusing to shrink. Because even if you don't change everything, you might change something, and sometimes that's enough to start the shift.